Hi, welcome to my channel. I'm Ysolda. I'm a knitwear designer based in Edinburgh, Scotland, and this is the second in a two-part series on how to knit my Musselburgh hat pattern, which I'm wearing right now. This is the original Musselburgh, which is very well loved. I wear it all the time. If you watched the first video and have been waiting for part two, I'm really sorry. I meant to have this up about a month ago, and April has just vanished. We were away over the sort of school holidays, and then I got really sick, feeling much better finally. So I wanted to sit down and record a little intro for this second part. It was originally going to be just one long video, but it got so super long that it made more sense to split it in two. And if you are new here or you haven't seen the first part, you're new to the Musselburgh hat, you might want to go back and watch part one, which really focuses on getting started, following the pattern, choosing your yarn, starting with the cast on and increases for the first crown. If you are new to the design, is worked from one crown to the other. You make this big long tube, and then when you're done, you put one crown inside the other to create a beanie, which you can wear kind of slouchy like I am here, or with the brim folded up. And so getting started on that crown can be a bit tricky, and the pattern is written for multiple gauges and lots of sizes, so it does display information a bit differently than you might be used to. So if you're new to the pattern, go watch part one. It'll give you lots of tips on how to get started. In this video, I wanted to focus on really getting your Musselburgh just how you want it to be. So nailing down your perfect fit, whether you want to wear it slouchy or you want the brim folded up, maybe you want a bit of slouch and a folded brim. You can really customize the length to suit you and how to get the circumference to fit just right. And I'll give you tips on making the most of your yarn, your stash, whether that's getting the most hat out of one skein, or some tips on putting together different colors or different fibers to create your own unique fabric, your own unique color palette, and make a Musselburgh that really suits your style. I'm also going to give you some tips on a question I get asked all the time, which is how to deal with the final tail you have, because when you finish, you're going to pull the stitches of your final crown together, and then you'll have a tail, but there's no way to get to the wrong side of the fabric now. So I'm going to show you how I handle that. My goal with this video is to help you enjoy knitting Musselburgh and get a result that you're really proud of and want to show up. Trust the pattern. This sounds so simple, but it's something I've seen a lot of people get confused about. When you're done increasing for the crown, as I am here, it's going to look really, really small in comparison to your head. If I kind of pop that on here, you can see that it does not look big enough to cover the whole crown of my head. That's fine. There are two reasons. First of all, you always want to make a hat smaller than your head. As I said, when talking about choosing a size, your finished circumference of your hat needs to be smaller than your head. You always need negative ease on a hat because it's going to stretch to fit you. If you made it the same circumference as your head, your hat would probably just fall off. You need that kind of stretch to hold your hat in place. And the second reason is that the crown of this hat is kind of almost flat. And there's like a little bit more expansion that happens when you start knitting without increasing. So the number of stitches you have to go across what's basically four triangles, four sides of a square. It's not quite a flat square, but the number of stitches you have across here between two of your kind of segments is more than the number of stitches you would need to go across a straight edge of a triangle of that width. So as you continue knitting without increasing, those stitches are going to sort of spread out a little bit more, and you will find that the whole circumference looks a bit bigger. With my completed hat here, I wanted to show you, it's got very convenient stripes. This stripe, this kind of pink stripe here, is pretty much the end of the crown increases. So you can see that, well, if I get it flat, that pink stripe does look a bit narrower in circumference. It's obviously narrower than this green one or this darker blue. The whole thing is continuing to curve out after I'm done with these increases. So if you keep on increasing until it looks like your little circle is big enough to cover the top of your head, you will end up with a tube much larger than your actual head. So you don't want that. So do trust the pattern, stop increasing when it tells you to, when you've worked the number of increases for your gauge and size combination. Trust the pattern. Don't worry that it looks small when you've done all of your increases. Just continue to knit without increasing, and I promise once you've done a couple more inches, it will look just fine. And once you put it on your head, you still need it to stretch a bit more. So don't panic that it looks small. Definitely don't decide to fix it and increase more. You absolutely do not want to do that. But how long you want your hat to be is very much personal preference. There is a length given in the pattern. It's obviously based on kind of standard size charts for the measurement from the crown to kind of your ear. And it's based on making a fairly fitted hat without a lot of extra slouch at the top if you wear it with the folded brim. If you wear it with the brim unfolded, then you will get slouch. If you want to wear your hat with the brim folded and have slouch, then I would add about 2 inches to the total finished length, or 1 inch on each half. But that may be something where you want to play around with it, you want to try on your hat in progress and see exactly what length works for you. I know a lot of people who've knit a lot of Musselburghs have just dialed in the exact length that they prefer. So how much slouch you have is dependent on the length. I love knitting top-down sweaters because you can try them on as you go. And the same goes for top-down hats, or Musselburghs kind of top-down to the middle and then bottom up. But anyway, you can try it on, and you can try it on kind of at any point once you've done a few inches past the crown increases. This one is almost ready to start decreasing. So it's a good example of trying it on just to see where you're at, check you're happy with the length before you start decreasing. Something to note is that the crown decreases perfectly mirror the crown increases, so those 2 sections will be the same length. So what I've done is I've transferred my stitches to a longer circular needle. You don't want to try it on a 16-inch needle because it won't fit around your head. So transfer your stitches to a longer needle. If you're close to the crown decreases and you're going to use magic loop, then you might just want to transfer those and stay on them. Otherwise, you can slip your stitches to a longer needle and then slip them off again. Or you could use some waste yarn. And then you want to pull your initial crown through so you can kind of see the reverse stockinette side. It's obviously going to be covered eventually, but at the moment, it makes it easier if you have that showing. And then you can kind of try and arrange it a little neatly, and then you can try it on at this point. See if you're happy. So if I was going to wear this slouchy, it would probably be a bit long already. It's got a lot of extra fabric, but I want to fold it up and I want a really nice deep brim. So I'm going to try folding that up and seeing whether my kind of live stitches are starting to line up with the bottom of my crown increases, and that way I'll know it's a good length for me to start decreasing at. You can do the exact same thing if your hat is not this long yet, and just try it on, see if you're happy. That's obviously easier if you're knitting for yourself or someone who's physically with you, but that can be a good way to double check. If you're working with a kind of drapey yarn, maybe something with silk or a superwash yarn, and you're worried it's gonna grow when you block it. You can also block it on the needles before you do your crown decreases. You can just get a bowl of water or use steam and just dunk the knitted fabric, but not your ball of yarn or your needle tips, into the water, or steam it with a steam iron or a sort of garment steamer. And that can give you a good sense of whether your particular yarn is going to grow when you block it and end up longer before you go to. If you try your hat on and it feels a little bit snug, something you can do is knit some extra length, because if you think about how knitted fabric stretches, if my head is stretching this out, it's going to get shorter. So if my head is stretching it out kind of more than, I don't know, the sort of tolerance of the fabric to stretch before it kind of shrinks lengthwise, then adding a bit of extra length to the crown decrease will allow you to have the kind of folded brim, the length you want for how much slouch you want when your fabric is stretched out a bit. If you try it on and it's really loose, you have less wriggle room. Depending on your yarn, you might be able to very slightly shrink it by kind of washing it in hot water, but that's something I would do very gently, cautiously. Your other options would be to rip it out or find someone with a bigger head or maybe more hair volume who would prefer a looser hat or a hat that fits their head. So you might be able to gift it, but there's less wriggle room with a looser hat than you were expecting than there is with one that's a little bit snug. If it's a little bit snug, adding some extra length can make a big difference. This Musselburgh was knit with a self-striping yarn. This is Gauge Dye Works, our solar system, in the one-way trip version. They do a round trip version of each of their colorways, which make matching socks. I would generally recommend using their one-way trip for a Musselburgh because you get two hats in one, rather than a hat that's the same on both sides. So if I open it up, you can see this whole thing. This end starts with this yellow, this end is much brighter, and then this end is much more subtle. It's gray with just a few colorful stripes and darker gray stripes. And it's self-striping, but it is a good example of kind of how the colors end up arranged on a Musselburgh. It's useful if you want to make a two-color version. It's really popular, or a version that has maybe different colors for the upper part of the hat and then different colors for the brim. You can think of the hat as being split into 4 sections. You can see here with the crisper fold where my center section or my center is, and then the brims are folded about sort of here. If you want two colors to actually be visible next to each other, if you're doing the folded brim version, then those two colors should not be next to each other on the knitting. If I fold this, I'll show you what I mean. So just the purple is here, and then we have this green stripe here. And then I fold the brim, you can see that the purple is showing up next to the more kind of subtle upper. And if I flip the whole thing over, and then I have to turn the brim the other way, my kind of more subtle green stripe then shows up with the more colorful side. I made a funny little paper example to kind of show how this would work if I wanted to do 4 colors and kind of split my hat into these 4 sections. So if I want pink and blue to show as one version, then I want to do my pink here and my blue brim separated from it. So when I fold it, I will indeed get my blue brim here. And then when I fold this section, I'll get my orange brim. And the pink and blue will be hidden. In the newest version of the pattern, which we updated a few weeks ago, version 3.0, it'll have 3.0 in the file name. There's now a page where you can color in your own hat, and there's a version with it sort of opened up and folded, so you can plan out that if I do crown A in blue, for example, and then I do brim C in, I don't know, pink, those will show up next to each other, crowns D and brim B show up next to each other. So that should help you plan out how any colors or maybe stripes are going to fall. And there's also now a table with measurements for each size for the lengths of the crown and the brim. You can, of course, customize those to suit your own preferences if you like a deeper brim or maybe a slouchier crown, but those will kind of break down the length given in the pattern into those sections so you know exactly how much to knit in each of your yarns, each of your colors. If you want to avoid seeing any kind of peak of the crown color at that fold on your brim, then you may want to extend that brim length just ever so slightly, sort of transition a bit earlier between the crown and the brim so that part of the bit of the brim that's tucked behind is in that brim color so you don't get any kind of show through of the color. Totally personal preference, but you may want to do that. If you are looking at your pattern and you're like, I don't have this page, then you do want to update your pattern. If you purchased it on Ysolda.com, you can log into your account if you haven't set up an account. You make sure if you haven't already set up an account, you can do so with the email address that you used when you first purchased the pattern, and then you'll be able to access any downloads for any patterns that you've previously purchased. You can do the same in your Ravelry library if you either purchased the pattern on Ravelry or you've added it from your Ysolda.com purchase to your Ravelry library. You'll be able to update the pattern on there. You're looking for the file name with version 3.0, unless we've updated it since I made this video, in which case it might be 3 point something else. But yeah, versions beginning with 3 have this coloring page, and there's also another page of tips for things like jogless stripes, working with scraps, playing around making the hat your own. That is a great supplement to this video, so do make sure you've updated your pattern. And if you color this in, I would love to see your kind of coloring pages and your finished hats. I think it'd be really fun to see those together and see what results you got from pre-planning your project. If you're pre-planning your project and you're watching this video before you've cast on, then start by weighing your full skein or your ball of yarn. I'm getting exactly 120 grams. My label says 115, so it is very rainy today in Scotland, so this might have absorbed some humidity, but I think what's probably really happening is Gauge Dye Works are being a little bit generous and they would rather have a skein that's slightly over than the one that's slightly under. But there are tolerances within yarns, so your yarn may not weigh exactly what it says on the label. So if you have a digital scale, weighing it is the best way to know how much yarn you're starting with. And knowing that can help you work out how much yarn you're using. So if you're doing this in a very organized way and pre-planning, you could knit your crown and then weigh the ball of yarn, weigh how much you have left. This is just a scrap, so this is definitely not enough for the rest of the hat. But you could pop that on your scale and see how much yarn you have left. And what that's going to allow you to do is take how much yarn you started with, how much you now have left after knitting the crown, and work out how much yarn that increasing crown used. Because once you have that number, you'll know how much yarn you need before starting your crown decreases. So that's how to do it if you were really organized and you haven't knit your crown yet. But one other option, if you have knit your crown and you have another needle that's the same or really similar to the needle your knitting is on, you could weigh your crown. So let's see what we've got here. I'm getting 16 grams for the crown and the needle. And then if I have another needle the same, I could pop that on my scale by itself and see what the needle weighs. Or I could pull my needle out of my stitches, either putting them on scrap yarn, or maybe when I'm ready to do my transfer to my shorter circular is a good time to do this. And then I could weigh the needle by itself and work out how much just the crown weighs. If you are close to your decreases, you think you're close to your kind of length before decreasing, and you haven't thought to weigh anything yet, but you would like to maximize how much you're using, you can also do some maths. So if you put in a safety pin where you are now, so on your current round, and then weigh how much yarn you have left in the ball, knit about an inch, weigh how much yarn you now have, you can then work out how much yarn each round used. So let's say I've got my 1 inch of knitting, I weighed my yarn before and after knitting that 1 inch, and I've worked out I've got 8 grams per inch. I'm then going to look at my increase crown and measure how long it is. How long it is from the cast on. So here in my adult medium, I'm getting 3 inches. If you're knitting a different size, that might vary a little bit. So, and your row gauge might be different than mine too. So best option is to measure your increase crown, because your decrease crown will be a mirror image. So that's 3 inches. If I have 8 grams per inch over my whole stitch count, then 3 inches would be 8 times 3, that's 24 grams. However, on the crown we have these 4 triangles. If you think about each triangle being part of a rectangle, something like this, then that rectangle has had kind of the 2 top corners folded into the middle to make a triangle. So those aren't part of our area, and that triangle is just half of the sort of total rectangle. So when we put the 4 of those triangles together, our total area of fabric is then half what it would be if we were knitting a tube with 4 of those rectangles together. And so instead of being 24 grams to knit these 3 inches of length, we're going to use something more like 12 grams, which means you can keep knitting stockinette until you have about 12 grams left. I would add a gram or 2 just for safety's sake, so I would probably stop knitting stockinette and switch to decreases when I have about 14 grams left. That's how to work out how much you'll use for the decreases if you didn't think about that until you were close to doing them. Before you start the crown decreases, or at least before you get to the end of them, it's definitely a good idea to weave in any ends from earlier in your project, whether that's from your cast on tail, or if you were working with contrast colors or scraps, you might have some other ends to weave in. It's a good idea to do that while you can still access the interior of the project. You could just flip the whole thing inside out, make sure you've taken care of those ends. But you'll still be left with one tail that you can't weave in from the inside, because in order to close the top of the hat, you need to pull these last remaining stitches together, and that blocks you from accessing the inside. So what I do is I take a fairly small tapestry needle. I'm using a contrast color here because I've already woven in the end and it's buried on the inside, and I figured it would make it easier to see what you're doing. So you want to take that to the inside, making sure you're not coming out anywhere else on your fabric. And then you really carefully want to kind of skim it. This is hard to show because you literally cannot see what I'm doing because it's on the inside, but you kind of want to skim it through the back of some stitches. You can kind of see my needle's just about coming out here. And then what I do is I do that a few stitches, and then I bring the whole thing through to the right side again, making sure I've not kind of caused any puckering. That's going to lie flat. And then I'll go back in and do the same thing, kind of just doing a random pattern, kind of skimming through the back of some stitches, trying to make sure I'm kind of changing direction. So I went down, now I'm going up a bit. I'm gonna come back through to the right side. And you can see even in my hot pink, you can't see that from the right side. So it's not gonna show through. And I'll do the same thing again down here. And then once I'm comfortable that that's going to be anchored, what I'll do is I'll go back into the project, into the wrong side, and then I'll just bring my needle out really far down. Making sure it's all kind of an open kind of bag. So I might bring it out way down here and then trim that end. So I've got like a longer tail on the inside. I'll trim that and then let it just pop through to the inside. And that should keep my end nice and anchored and keep that sort of where the stitches are pulled together at the crown from opening up. When your hat's complete, I recommend blocking it. I would usually wet block, just soak your project, maybe in some wool wash, in some lukewarm water, squeeze it out gently in a towel. And then I often like to block hats in like a three-dimensional way. Balloons work well, but for Musselburgh, I tend to block it flat because otherwise you just have so many layers of fabric on top of each other that it takes ages to dry. So I tend to block it flat. The crowns just won't lie perfectly smooth. Don't worry about it, but do try and make sure that the kind of length versus width is to the measurements, is to the length that you're happy with. When it's wet, it's really easy to kind of stretch it one way or the other. So make sure you're kind of blocking it to the proportions you want, and then just leave it to dry. Once it's dry and you want to put one end in the other, you can get a sort of crisper fold by gently steaming just that fold, or even pressing it with like a damp towel over it to get that crisper fold. But I also find that just over time wearing it, that kind of center fold will end up in place crisply. My final tip for Musselburgh is to get creative. Look to the community for inspiration. At the time of recording this, I think there were 21,000 Ravelry projects. There are thousands of posts on Instagram using the Musselburgh hat hashtag. So there are lots of other people's projects to get inspired by. You can knit a really simple hat in a solid color. You can combine more than one yarn. You could hold two yarns together, like this one, which is in a single ply fingering weight yarn and a lace weight mohair held together. It gives a really lovely soft halo and kind of a very slouchy drapey hat. Self-striping yarn like this one from Gauge Dye Works are really fun, and you can also do kind of manual stripes where you just create your own stripes, and there are some fantastic projects where people have done that and made completely different hats in one, maybe with a solid on one side and stripes on the other, or with different stripe patterns. You can kind of do faded marled effects with holding different scraps together. You can also use different kinds of yarn. By far the most popular is light fingering or fingering weight, but you can also use a sort of decayed worsted weight yarn, or do something really fine with a lace weight yarn. There's a pretty broad range of yarns covered in this multi-gauge pattern, and I really like the simplicity of this really woolly yarn for this one. This is in Tuku wool, and it's kind of crunchy. It's super warm and cozy. If you live in a really cold climate, this is definitely the kind of hat for you. I've been blown away by how knitters like you have used Musselburgh as the kind of scaffolding to create their own incredible, beautiful, unique projects, and how much knitting the hat has become kind of a consistent part of so many people's knitting lives. It's almost rare to see someone knit one just once, and I know for many of you, Musselburgh is something you work on during meetings or while watching a sports practice or whatever you're doing where you need to keep your hands busy. And it means so much to me to think of this simple little hat pattern becoming so much of the fabric of your daily life. So I always want to see what you do with the pattern. I'm constantly amazed when I continue to see like new unique ideas and just really beautiful color combinations. I see new Musselburghs every day that blow me away. What was I gonna say? Yeah, I just really hope that this video has helped you feel confident about knitting the pattern, whether you haven't knit Musselburgh yet or you're on your 10th one and looking for some new ideas and inspiration. And as always, do subscribe to my channel if you want to hear more about my design process and my patterns and more tutorials and knitting tips. Do make sure you subscribe, and you can find the Musselburgh hat and all of my other hat patterns, including the Porty hat that I mentioned earlier, on my website, Ysolda.com, and on Ravelry. And until next time, happy knitting. Take care. Bye.